welcome to another episode of The Spoken You with Jeff and Brett. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. So glad you could join us here on The Spoken You in our discourse to seek knowledge. From knowledge comes wisdom, but it's preceded by questioning, and that's what we're here to do. Today, we're turning the clock forward to talk about the elderly. Yep, senior citizens.
I think we should just get into it. And the best way to kind of get into talking about the elderly, in my opinion, is start talking about how we view the elderly. What stereotypes, possibly do we have? So let me ask you, Brett, when you just think of elderly in general, what comes to mind? How do you view the elderly, or what do you think people in our society view the elderly?
Well, our society per se. I mean, I'd love. I mean, when you ask me, the first word that pops in my head, I want to say wisdom. I want to think about the gray-haired old woman, kind of dancing on the edge of the village. Everyone gets gray, and it just, to me, I associate gray with wisdom. I associate wrinkles with, time, and I would love to believe that we're all just getting wiser every day with all the experiences. But on the other end of the spectrum, you got grumpy. Like you think about grumpy old men. That old classic movie with Walter Matthau and what's his name, Lemon, John Lennon.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's kind of the paradigm. It's like, do you get wiser or do you get grumpier, or are the two necessarily mutually exclusive?
My question, my response would be, in just kind of digging into this issue a little bit. Somebody brought up a good point, and it kind of makes sense. Is we often, I think there is a part of people that sees, older people as either depressed, or you get older and you're losing loved ones, or I'm grumpy. The version of grumpy old men that you're talking about. And
Right.
it's funny because somebody makes this point. I was looking into it. As this psychologist at Emory University, he says, cases of elderly who are grumpy and depressed and irritable and angry are memorable because they have an impact on us emotionally. Cases of elderly that are doing just fine don't have much of an impact on us because they don't stand out in our memories. Where he says media coverage and popular movies reinforce these negative stereotypes. And, I got to thinking, it's funny because you exactly just mentioned, grumpy old men. And that's, what kind of role does, media and these things play in, our version of how we view old people?
Hey, like, get off my lawn,
Yeah.
like the old man shaking the cane at you. I mean, even like going somewhere like Family Guy, where like I think the most consistent elderly character is a child molester. Ultimately, you know what I mean, and like a dirty old man, and we think about the sexualization of older men as being dirty. Ultimately, as if And then on the same token, there's a commercial for Viagra. Every other commercial break reinforcing how people should, older men should still be able to get it up. But that dirty old man notion is so far removed from like Gandalf. You know what I mean? You don't see,
Right.
You don't know what's going on under his robe. You know what I mean? I don't know. I mean, it's such this dichotomy because I guess ultimately we all want to believe on some level we're going to reach some level of enlightenment or some level of happiness, this golden age, and it just seems like such a gamble, just based on media alone. Do we end up the wise character that kind of changes the direction, or are we just like literally the crazy human being wandering the earth that's just an extra?
I mean, it's no surprise. I mean, the statistics are out there that the suicide rate among, the elderly is much higher than other places. And, if you look at that, but also happiness goes up too. So it's a dichotomy of kind of like happiness versus, suicide. And, there's a good example of kind of like, you can look at, like you were talking about, we were talking a little bit before we went on the air about the Scandinavia countries and happiness and level of happiness. And there's another example of, countries that often get nominated as the happiest places on earth, but yet have the highest suicide rate. So it's interesting in that sense of, the elderly having that same kind of, both sides to it.
Well, I was on the Travel Channel thing about happiest countries, and so this whole HDI, Happiness Index, or whatever it's called, Happiness Development Index, or whatever it's called, HDI, I think it's called. Um, it varies. There's a lot of schools of thought because the Travel Channel was saying Central America made 7 of the 10 countries. Then you had Vietnam, Jamaica, Colombia, and Venezuela. So I'm sorry, Central America made 6. And having just come from there, I do agree. And there was Swedes there, and there was Danish people there, and there were Norwegians there that definitely did not exude as much happiness as I've seen in places like Indonesia or Fiji, and definitely Central America. So I don't know. I mean, maybe because they don't have to worry about survival, but I don't know. I've often seen Denmark at the top of the list, and it's just interesting that there's so many different happiness surveys.
Well, it kind of brings it
Um,
to, a nice transition point, as you were talking travel. I mean, we didn't get too much into, we can get back to about how maybe Americans view our elderly, but you know, going overseas and traveling, did you find or see, just a different example of the importance of, certain members of the family, having a more of a valuable role in these communities that you visited?
well, I mean, I would definitely remark upon like the notion of a second life. Like I found like expats are overseas to like live kind of more simple life. Like a lot of people retire in Mexico, man. A lot of people have retired in Indonesia. A lot of people have retired in just a lot of countries I've been to, and they kind of call it a second life. My uncle's French, and he started visiting Dominican Republic. He bought a house, and then eventually sold his house, and now makes contributions to kind of that small village, and it's not uncommon, and Americans as well. But the thing is that you don't find people in those countries and developing nations sending their elderly away to go to another country to live a cheaper life to find that happiness that they're with. They live with the family,
Yeah, so
for
why
better
is that?
or
Why
for
do you think you see like Americans like that, getting out of Dodge? Is it because here in our culture we don't respect them the way we should and they stay within their culture overseas because they've kind of put in their time? I mean, for me, for example, being in Indonesia for a bit of time, I noticed that their birthrights, they do nothing for. It is not important for when they're born. It's not a huge celebration. Specifically talking about, in the Sulawesi area, in the whole Tanah Toraja type of feeling, which is steeped in heavy tradition. And it's funny, they don't celebrate the birth, but they really celebrate the death. When you get old, you're always working for your elders. It's this kind of rite of passage that the kids will, they'll grow up, they'll get an education if they can, and or work on the farm, but their idea is to build their wealth to pay for their parents' eventual death. I mean,
whoa.
it's this whole kind of, respect the elders in that way, so much so that if, even if they die and they can't afford the funeral right away, that's when the kind of the creepiness comes in to some people, is where they keep them kind of embalmed or they keep them hanging around in the house for a while until they're able to have this huge festival that lasts many days. It's all about showing the wealth and a bunch of other, kind of odd things. But, to us from an outsider standpoint, but if you look at it in the case of kind of this respect factor, I mean, they're really valuing the life that this person lived, where I don't know that we necessarily do that here.
Well, to me, it reminds me a lot of the notion of debt. Like we're kind of I think in America specifically, we're kind of painted paying it forwards in a way, because it's like our parents paid for us, so now we have to pay. It's going to cost us $250,000 to have a child in this day and age, and with inflation, we're kind of paying it forward. We want to give our kids a better life than we received, and our parents want to give us a better life than they received, and their parents wanted to give them a better life than they had. But I think it's kind of a reverse world of debt. Like, we owe it because we were given it by our parents. We got to pay it forward to our kids. As where it's the opposite role in the most of the rest of the world, is that unless you come, you're part of some sort of upper echelon of a developing nation where everyone is living, a pretty high degree of luxury. I'm thinking it's just the fundamentals of how we view debt and how we're indebted to our ancestors. I mean, our ancestors, generally here, you ask someone, well, where was your great grandmother from? And they're like, well, I didn't get the swab yet for the genetic testing. I'm not exactly sure where she's really from, and
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're just so connected, but that's an immigrant society. You know what I mean? We are, for the most part, an immigrant society. And when you go to countries where people have ultimately lived there in the same town for generations, it I don't know. I think but it comes back down to debt to me, because it feels like in every other country, you owe it to the elders in one fashion or another.
And just because of being an immigrant, we don't owe it. But then why, even if we don't owe it here, as an immigrant or something like that, it seems to take a hold of, even going to the extreme and going to the opposite in my mind. I mean, so much so that we're not, most of us aren't ready to willing to accept the responsibility of taking an elderly parent into the home. It's off to the nursing home, it's off to this care facility, it's hiring somebody to take care of them, because we're busy living our own lives for us. Where, again, you see in these other cultures, that's like almost the ultimate form of debt. What you're talking about is bringing this person. Actually, a lot of them stay in the home the entire time. I mean, kids grow up with the grandparents in the home, and
Sure.
and so on. And that doesn't really, happen here. You see isolation happen. You see, forgetfulness of the life that they provided for, people. I mean, to me, it almost comes down to a little bit of lack of, respect almost, and I don't really know where that stems from.
Well, again, I mean, think of it this way. You probably know a lot of people. Like my dad, for example, he's first generation. I mean, I'm first generation American. He's from France. Um, and he came here to build a better life. And it's not like he came here and was sending money back. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't a French culture. When people came here, they were trying to make a better life. The dollar was stronger, blah blah blah. But I mean, and I'm not saying everybody, but I think if you look at, first generation Americans, or with immigrant parents, it really depends on the country, because I mean, and I'll get to the irony in a sec, but I guess what really sticks with me is, like, if you're, I mean, maybe Italy back when, but I think for the most part, people aren't from Western Europe aren't sending money back home to, like, maybe to bring someone over, but for the most part, it's not like they're, when I think about like a lot of my friends from Mexico that have spent thousands of dollars to have a coyote and cross the border and get over here. They were sent and they were endorsed and sponsored ultimately by their families to send money back, to empower the family to either send more people, maybe, I don't know, but they definitely were helping out the family back home, and the Philippines, and many other countries, Indonesia as well, where you get the opportunity to come to a first world nation. Well, you're gonna send a portion of your check back to the family. So it might come down to some real fundamental values that people really have around family and immigration as well. And just regarding that irony, it's like a lot of people working in the elderly homes are, of Hispanic descent, of Filipino or Asian descent, maybe Jamaican, or African, South American, wherever. So it's funny that we're kind of like these people, these folks, immigrants, come to the country, and then they end up taking care of people's parents that they don't want to, only to send money back to their parents, to kind of justify leaving in the first place. So it's kind of an interesting cycle.